Good evening, everybody. I hope you can hear me. I'm no expert at Zoom conferences, so I'm going to have to trust that you can. Welcome to the middle of the Gustav Metzger lecture series at Ben Uri. Let me just get rid of something clicking. Tonight's a very special evening for a whole range of reasons, not least because the rain has stopped, certainly in London, and that's a very exciting prospect. So tonight we have, as I say, the middle of the series. It's a series of 9 different lectures and discussions. And what's important to understand is that whilst we have an amazing exhibition on site, having transformed the institution into principally a digital institution supported by a physical presence, we can actually expand our engagement with you to the level of having 9 different lectures. And also our curator, Nicola, has just launched today 5 exhibitions online at benuri.org, one of which is the exhibition that is here in case you can't get here, and 4 other thematic analysis and evaluations of Metzger's work. So the exploration of Metzger is across a very wide landscape, and that's one of the great benefits of actually featuring a domestic presence, a domestic digital presence. Tonight, we are very privileged to have 2 not only distinguished curators and art historians, but experts on Gustav Metzger, both of whom have worked with him for a number of years. Andrew Wilson, who is our first speaker this evening, first met Metzger as a student at Sussex University in 1983. So he has a third of a century of engagement with this extraordinary individual, and was involved, and obviously, Andrew, you'll correct me if I use the wrong terminology, but I think captivated by the mercurialness of this artist and this individual. So even right through your university career, you were engaging with him, and then throughout your career, which I guess across a number of different exercises, but perhaps one of the highlights was your pioneering of this exhibition, of your exhibition of Metzger's work at Tate in 1995. I know you've published extensively on Metzger. You've contributed to the Ben Uri book on Metzger, which we're incredibly grateful for. And Andrew, you just recently left Tate after 15 years as a senior curator to concentrate on, I suspect, your first love, which is scholarly writing and curatorial work. And we look forward very much to the book that you are currently focusing on Metzger, which I hope will come out sometime next year. So thank you for joining us. Lizzie, may I introduce you next? So before Andrew starts, Lizzie is a distinguished curator and art historian who for the last 20 years has worked very much independently, but with major and important institutions, not least the wonderful Kettle's Yard in Cambridge and the equally wonderful Whitney in New York, both of which for me, if I'm in one place or the other, are absolute non-missable visits. Your experiences with Metzger are more recent, but nonetheless extremely potent. And you've been involved in 2009 curating an exhibition at the Fermany Gallery in King's Lynn, which I remember well, and I think still very much a very important part of Metzger's career in terms of looking back at his presence on the UK scene. You're currently a Leverhulme Career Research Fellow at Northumbria University, and your research looks at post-war experimental and expanded art practice in the rural north. Being a Scotsman, of course, I greatly appreciate that thought. So tonight we really are privileged to have both Andrew and Lizzie with us, and I'd just like to give you some house rules, if I may. We are not going to have questions intersposed within presentations or immediately after Andrew's. Please use the raised hand feature, which is sort of that, but in gold, I think it is, to acknowledge that you wish to ask a question. It will stay there, and my colleagues, Munai, Charlotte, Nicola, and Leanne, somebody will identify and ask you to unmute and ask the question to either Lizzie, Andrew, or by all means to Nicola, Leanne, who are the curators of the exhibition here tonight. That's basically it for me. I will come back at the end, but again, welcome to everybody. Welcome to Ben Uri's lecture series on Gustav Metzger. And Andrew, can I please pass the baton to you? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, David. And yeah, I'm really happy to be here tonight to continue this program that you've begun and to celebrate the two exhibitions, both the actual and the virtual one that has just launched. So I'm really going to just ask a few general questions in my presentation about what it meant for Metzger to retrieve this body of early work. So I'm just going to try and share screen and hope it works. Okay, that's fantastic. A white void, right. Bringing Gustav Metzger's early painting out into the light, and I should say that I've got my computer's a bit antiquated, so if I'm sounding a bit faint, you probably need to turn your volume up as high as you possibly can. So apologies for that. So bringing Gustav Metzger's early painting out into the light begs a number of questions. Most of these projections have probably no real substance that could be answered in any number of ways according to bias. Why recover the paintings? And why, when he did in 2010, 45 years after he had stored them all away? Why did he put them in storage in the first place, affecting a kind of erasure on his pre-1959 work? And now these works have taken on a second life. Are we looking at the paintings in a different way to how we would if they had never been hidden? Although if they had never been hidden, perhaps Metzger's career might have been one with a very different shape. Similarly, does the presence of these paintings make us consider his achievements anew? A good place to start is this spread from Stephen Bann's book from 1970, Experimental Painting. It shows on the left a painting by Frank Auerbach, reproduced in black and white, alongside a painting by Michael Andrews in the top right corner, and at bottom right, a painting by Metzger. When I first came across this book in 1983, I had only just met Metzger and become aware of his work. And for the next 30 years, it was not just this image of the blue painting on mild steel that came to mind if I tried to conjure up what Metzger's painting might have amounted to and how to characterize it. It was also the way that this spread placed Metzger's painting into a very specific context, a lineage in common with Auerbach that went back to David Bomberg, and an attention to and break from traditional practice that underpinned Kittai's use of the term School of London and that Michael Andrews himself epitomized. However, Bann's extensive and illuminating text on Metzger in this book makes clear that the painting did not exemplify the breadth of his paintings since the 1940s. Instead, it marked a success which amounted to a turning away from painting. This painting and others like it, such as these other steel paintings made at the same time, and some of which were shown at Metzger's first solo exhibition in 1958, for him marked the last paintings because they successfully pointed to an artistic activity Metzger had been reaching for since he first told David Bomberg in 1946 that the painting he was searching had to be, quote, both fast and intense. The narrative that Bann unfolds in 1970 is very similar indeed to that which Metzger had explained 5 years earlier in a lecture at the Architectural Association, around the time he had placed all his painting into storage. Ban positions this 1958 painting on a sheet of mild steel as a key turning point for Metzger, and he writes that, quote, "The material applied was still pigment, but the palette knife which was used to apply it was also employed to scrape and incise the steel. Traces of white chalk, which the artist knew and intended to be impermanent, were added." In a note to Ban accompanying the reproduced photograph of the work, Metzger identified it as one of the last paintings I produced, adding, "From 1956, I had painted in this studio mostly on hardboard, always using the palette knife." In sending the photograph for inclusion in Ban's book, Metzger proposed that his last painting formed the genesis of his mature practice and represented the culmination of 2 years' experimentation with a palette knife. In 1953, he had moved from London to King's Lynn, resigned from the Borough Bottega, become disassociated from Bomberg, and had stopped painting. When he returned to the medium 3 years later in 1956, it was with renewed purpose that was allied to an increasing expression of social responsibility. His work started to directly connect his artistic practice to his involvement with local conservation causes and anti-nuclear activities. This culminated in 1960 when he became a founder member of the Committee of 100, and these activities were recognized to be bound up with and inseparable from the theory and practice of autodestructive art as it emerged, and correspondingly, the end of painting as it had been previously understood by him. Concentrating on the acid on nylon painting as a decisive break from his previous way of painting, Ban then identifies the ways in which there is a complete transfer of destructive energy from the artist to the material. He simply allows himself to be the channel through which these destructive forces are communicated to the public. And though the possibilities of self-knowledge and perhaps of artistic fulfillment may be somewhat limited by the automatism of the creative destructive element, the possibility of holding out to public witness the phenomenon of destruction more than compensates for this in the view of Metzger, who never loses sight of the possibility of transforming social attitudes through an aesthetic of revulsion. Ban then concludes that the final purpose of autodestructive art is to become, quote, "a constructive force in society." The rediscovery of Metzger's early works and their emphasis on art as object, paintings and drawings, more or less conventionally produced on canvas, board, and paper, but also steel and plastic, provides a direct contrast to the narrative established by Ban, to which these works' existence seems almost to be a distraction. On the face of it, the survival of such a volume of work from the period before 1959 apparently might not materially explain or enhance Metzger's subsequent achievement as it had developed after 1965. And this may even be one reason why he kept it all hidden for so long. In his 1965 lecture, Metzger describes how his experience of painting jumps from 1946 and a conversation with my teacher, David Bomberg, where Metzger told him that the painting he hoped for, as I've already said, had to be extremely fast and intense. And Metzger's narrative jumps from that moment to 1957 and what he called his strong dissatisfaction with the materials of painting. I needed something tougher to work against than board, which led him the following year to using his palette knife on sheets of mild steel. However, though the steel material satisfied him, the process of painting still did not fulfill his search for intensity and use of modern technological materials, what he called presses of tremendous power that respond to a minute fraction of an inch, I wanted to make sculptures with these machines, controlling them rather like an organist does his instrument. Months later, he hit on the idea of autodestructive art. And as he says, looking back on my development, I see that I had exhausted the medium of paint on canvas as far as the expression of a fast, intense vision was concerned. In 1960, with the acid on nylon technique, I had found it. Such an account as this implies that the period 1946 to 1957 served for Metzger little more purpose than finding where his dissatisfaction with painting might lead, a period of searching for a way to paint and then a way beyond painting. In this respect, the painting reproduced in Band's book has to stand for the course of his painting practice between 1945 and 1958, however varied it was, as the exhibition at the Ben-Uri explains, typifying how it intersected and drew on Bomberg's teaching and also diverged from the spirit in the mass via Metzger's desire for speed and intensity in his painting, and then for something more fluid, contingent, and event-based. All of this was signaled in the use of mild steel, the palette knife, and especially the chalk, its fragility and ephemerality contrasting with the speed and violence of the palette knife, and with the hard, industrially forged surface of the steel sheet. This manipulation of a materiality of violence and vulnerability provided a clear basis for the development of his subsequent use of acid on nylon. So, in 1965, Metzger was already portraying his very recently hidden away paintings as irrelevant. Yet 5 years earlier, and a couple of months after his first lecture demonstration of autodestructive art, he had placed this body of work, now shown at the Ben-Uri, into the foreground in a retrospective solo exhibition at a commercial gallery that ordinarily specialized in icon paintings. In one sense, the Temple Gallery exhibition was a belated homage to the continuing importance of his teacher, David Bomberg, who had died 3 years before in relative obscurity. Metzger's text for the show foregrounds Bomberg in his narrative, and also the experimental nature of the painting he encouraged. And Metzger writes, today, when action painting and abstract expressionism are taught at leading art schools, it is important to realize that in 1945, David Bomberg's class at Borough Polytechnic was the only school in England where ideas and forms that had points of contact with the New York school were consistently developed and practiced. In the work of this class, Metzger took a leading part. Metzger's reaction to the increasingly destructive tendencies of society led to the development of his theory of autodestructive art. So, in this narrative that Metzger proposes, autodestructive art was a development in painting rather than a break from it, as he held it to be 5 years later. The other key aspect of Metzger's approach to art, whether painting or not, was an attention to social responsibility within an artist's makeup. This was underscored by Bomberg, but also would have been common nature to Metzger, not only because of the place of such an attitude within his upbringing, but also as a result of his traumatic experiences leading up to and during the war that reinforced the necessity he felt for his art and his person to bear witness. Works that he had retrieved from storage in 2010 were not publicly exhibited until 2012, when a large group of works on paper and 3 of the smaller mild steel paintings were shown at Documenta 13 in Kassel. These works on paper were shown within vitrines, as you can see here, down the central spine of the Documenta Halle exhibition space. The vitrines were prominently positioned and exuded a quiet presence. Each was covered by cloths to protect the drawings from the high light levels that had to be lifted in order to view the drawings and then replaced before moving on to the next cloth and the next group of drawings. This way of looking echoed the heightened and intensely physical experience of viewing his historic photographs, such as To Crawl into Anschluss, Vienna, March 1938 from 1996, which is shown in the top right corner of this slide, in which images such as that one are covered over or screened from direct view. The drawings are to be read through what we then knew of Metzger, his history and his evolution of an art practice that fused together art and activism. Not conventionally presented hanging on the walls of the gallery, the drawings became both objects as well as a form of documentation. The fact that they had been hidden and damaged was now also of intrinsic importance to their meaning and interpretation. Relics that showed their age as a form of arrested destruction, often creased, damaged, distorted, and ravaged by fluctuations in humidity. For the curator of the Documenta, Caroline Christoph Bakakiev, these drawings suggested what she called a loop in time, and a paradox given Metzger's care to preserve his work in the face of the possibility of nuclear annihilation during the Cold War and his later formulation of auto-destructive and auto-creative art. This loop in time, I think, is key today to understanding the place of Metzger's early paintings within his wider oeuvre. Such work can now be seen in terms of the ethics of auto-destructive art, if not strictly speaking its theory and practice, rather than purely as evidence of the course of Metzger's developing practice as a painter after 1945. We start with the break signaled by his work of 1958 and 59, and then work both backwards and forwards equally. Alternatively, we can at the same time, as part of this process, view the emergence of these early works as being to a degree a late work by Metzger, in parallel to the way that from 1996, he began remaking his earlier work for exhibition. He gave the Documenta presentation the title Too Extreme, perhaps in recognition of this, a title that also recalls his 1968 presentation at the filtration laboratory of the Chemical Engineering Department of University College Swansea, Extremes Touch, in which materials and contrasting techniques were brought together. For instance, a water droplet would hover above and condense above a hot plate in a perpetual cycle of material transformation. However, what was too extreme about the drawings shown at Documenta? Significantly, the choice of works at Documenta was limited to the decade between 1948 and 1958. There were a large group of drawings concentrated on the period between 1948 and 49, when he was living and working in Antwerp and alternating between different distortions of Northern European expressionist realism, revealing debts to artists as various as Vincent van Gogh, Constant Permacher, and James Ensor. A smaller group of drawings executed between 1950 and 1953 was also selected to show Metzger now returned to London, becoming more closely associated with David Bomberg. Then there were drawings dating from 1956 to 57 that culminate in the group of paintings on steel and related drawings from 1958 that were exhibited separately in an adjoining room. What was emphasized by this selection was how a deeply felt expressionism shifted by 1956 to 57 to an abstraction in which the reading of a figure or paired figures dissolve into otherwise abstract marks. In some ways, the paintings on mild steel and related drawings seem unrelated to such a progression, having an apparent basis in architectural structures rather than human forms, demonstrated too by Metzger's use of what was unequivocally an industrial material. Yet recalling the focus given to the painting on mild steel, both in his account in his 1965 lecture and in Band's 1970 book, the drawings and vitrines in the Documentahalle also document distinctive pathways towards this culminating expression just prior to the first elaborations of autodestructive art, by unambiguously communicating how vulnerable human existence was in the post-war world. So these works, and these are views of some of the works as they came out of his storage. These works speak not only to their own material survival, but also to the survival of the way of thinking and the way of life that they represent. Principles of documentation, the evidence of what was left behind, recording existence, was keenly held onto by Metzger while he made largely ephemeral work that could be experienced but not owned. The survival of these works and Metzger's care not to destroy them and then to re-release them to the world suggests the hope that through an attention to indexical traces of presence, not everything disappears. For decades, Metzger kept their existence hidden, yet safe, given their potential as documentation of a creative life. Of greater significance, however, is how these works powerfully voice expressions of individual trauma and the post-war experience of rebuilding life in the shadow of the Holocaust and the atom bomb. They reflect the dawn of the Anthropocene era in the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and subsequent nuclear weapons testing, a realization which remained at the heart of Metzger's work, charting tensions between nature and technology. For these fundamental reasons, as well as the fact that Metzger was no iconoclast, he could conceal these from view, but he could not destroy them. During the more than 40 years that they were hidden away, he harnessed destructive forces and process as a creative act. He made work that bears witness to our capacity for destruction, erasure, and extinction. And I think that's where I end. So I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to hand over to Lizzie, and thank you very much.
Right. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Thank you, Andrew. That was a fantastic way into the exhibition and really insightful and thoughtful. And I hope that what I'm going to give you now is as interesting. It's different. So I suppose without further ado, I'll start sharing my slides and we'll take it from there. Okay, right. So when I think about Gustav and his engagement with aesthetics, and that's particularly what I wrote about for the book that accompanies this exhibition, this is always where I start. And of course, you might be thinking, why not start with the paintings? But I think the cardboards, which Gustav first found and presented in 1959, I think they tell you something about the paintings and something about Gustav's aesthetic sensibility that runs throughout his practice and informs the way that you look at them. So this image here shows the cardboards themselves, which were television packaging, which he found completely by chance on the Fulham Road. It was, if you like, a sort of eureka moment when he discovered these. But there are some important things to note about these cardboard pieces. And that is that they were, when he found them, in perfect condition. They're machine cut, folded pieces of cardboard, which create three-dimensional shapes, structures with shadows and edges and interlocking parts and proportion, all the kind of formal qualities that you might read into an abstract painting or sculpture. And Gustav said of these works that he was struck by the beauty of the material. They were simply beautiful and in perfect condition. He likened their forms to the greatest in modern painting, sculpture, and architecture in his first manifesto, which was released on the event, in the event of this exhibition at Monmouth Street in November 1959. So this is the first example of a work which I want to show you to start with. Here is the next. And these are photographs by Ida Carr of Gustav Metzger, taken in 1960, carrying, on the left, he's carrying a bag full of rubbish through Trafalgar Square. And on the right, one of those bags of rubbish is hanging in a lecture demonstration where he's talking to an audience about this and about other aspects of his practice. In the background, you can see pages from a daily newspaper. Behind him, there's a screen where he will make a demonstration of the acid nylon painting. And on the table he's leaning on are these steel pieces, which was part of a model for his first autodestructive monument, which was never realized. But just to go back for a minute and explain, these rubbish bags were also found by chance. They were clear plastic bags full of scraps of fabric or paper patterns, and they're left outside the fashion houses on Great Marlborough Street in Soho in the evenings for the council to come and pick up as rubbish. And Gustav saw in them the same formal qualities that he saw in the cardboards. Well, I say the same, but slightly different. In these bags, he talked about a chaotic formlessness and obviously the emphasis on chance as a source of beauty. And he used them in these lecture demonstrations, which I'll talk a little bit about later, as examples of what he called the most significant aesthetic realist experiences available to us. These were, if you like, beauty for free, provided you could understand the potential of the simplest and plainest materials. So on the face of it, these represent a pretty decisive break from the painterly experiments that we see in the exhibition and the languages of modern painting, expressionism, abstraction, vorticism, which are all being tried and tested by Metzger in the period looked at. But I draw your attention to a quote from the famous modernist critic Clement Greenberg, who, when he was talking about modernism's break with the past, he said it wasn't a break, but actually more a dialectical turn, a relationship between two opposites that creates a place for each to exist, moving well beyond well-tried conventions and habits, but at the same time maintaining or even restoring the highest aesthetic standards of the past. And in the same way, I think the cardboards and the rubbish bags represent this same dialectical turn, a broadening of Metzger's palette and a recognition or assertion of the same aesthetic values, an extension of aesthetic experience that draws on powerful memories from his childhood, and his childhood, which was spent in Nuremberg. His memories, particularly of Nuremberg, of the architecture, the medieval architecture, the pageantry and spectacle of Nazi rallies there too. But also, in contrast, his memories of the Orthodox Jewish religious rituals that his family were deeply involved in, and the prevalence of the senses and the elements in these rituals, the importance of elements like water, fire, and light, as opposed to images. Now, these were both, I think, formative aesthetic experiences which were heavily invested in symbolism, that are visual but also visceral, involving all the senses and emotions. And they created a space, I would argue, for an understanding of aesthetics in terms of the original Greek etymology of the word. So aesthetikos, which means sensitive, sentient, pertaining to sense perception, to perceive by the senses of the mind, or to feel. But then, of course, images are where he started, and on Henry Moore's advice, when he first decided to become an artist and undertake some training. So I've included here a slide showing one of the table paintings from 1956 and a drawing also around 1956 of the same motif, if you like. And what I'd like to draw your attention to here is the exuberant sensuality in the use and the mixing of materials, the frantic mark making, holes where paper's being rubbed right through, and the buttery, viscous paint. There's an assertion of materiality in the sheer tactility of these works. Looking at them, I can imagine the smell of the paints, the pigments, their motility and resistance, or the friction between them and the support. The sheer physicality in making and in the tracing of the gestures, the movement of his arm or the control in his hands. But of course, you can also see a working through of prevailing aesthetic ideas like Fry and Bell's significant form and Bomberg's spirit in the mass, as Andrew was saying. But also under Bomberg's influence, this attempt to balance or combine revolutionary content and revolutionary form. The motif in these pictures is a table, potentially quite a quotidian sort of subject matter, but this table form, which he painted repeatedly over a year or 2 years in King's Lynn. It was just a table he'd found in a junk shop, and was probably part of the stock that he was selling on King's Lynn marketplace to earn a living at that point. But the table shape also conveyed, well, it had correspondences with the mushroom cloud, which was produced by the first atom bomb. And these works were made around a time when Gustav was just getting involved in anti-nuclear protests and CND and the Committee of 100, and he was heavily involved in a great deal of campaigning and lobbying around that time. He was also involved in other I suppose, campaigning projects around the gentrification of an area in King's Lynn. But the anti-nuclear campaigning is a theme that kind of started then, but also was engaged with a sense of his sort of a deep environmentalism and a sense of the destructive forces that man was unleashing on the natural world, such as the atom bomb. So in a sense, and Metzger has talked about this, the motif of the table with its resonances to the mushroom cloud were an attempt to merge this political, social awareness, a sort of a need to have a sense of social responsibility, and make this clear through his art. But at the same time, of course, this notion of this forging of ethics and aesthetics, he was already engaged with, having read in the 1940s in Leeds, Eric Gill on aesthetics and social reform, and Gill's advocacy of a kind of medieval asceticism that also combined with an integration of art and industry and craft and religion. So this also sort of set his compass a little. By the time he's in King's Lynn, he's sort of revisiting these ideas. And as Nicola discusses in her essay, Bomberg also represented an important mentor with a similar sense of the artist's social responsibility. Of course, as Andrew's mentioned, we know he pretty much abandoned painting, not around 1960, but perhaps 1962, but the expression of this, the sensuality that you see in these works, is what he keeps hold of, I think, in the experience with other materials and processes that follow. And this is actually the point at which I first connected with Gustav, if you like. So what I'm showing you here are some of the projection techniques he used in lecture demonstrations that he developed between 1960 and 65. These lecture demonstrations were a sort of hybrid platform which combined a traditional lecture format with more experimental demonstrations of his auto-destructive and auto-creative techniques. Remember, these lecture demonstrations coincide with the writing of a series of 5 manifestos, starting in 59, and the last one is in 1964. So these demonstrations that happen in the lecture demonstrations are not actual works as such, but processes that could be deployed in creating auto-destructive or auto-creative works. In the final manifesto in 1964, he actually coined the term material transforming art to describe both kinds of work. And I think I'll stick with that as we go forward. So these lecture demonstrations were events, they were performances, they were some of the first light projections that people had ever seen, and they were kind of immersive installations. So what I'm showing you here from left to right, on the left, you can see the liquid crystals, and these were developed. There was a process developed with a chemist. Actually, he was a protein chemist and immunologist called Arnold Feinstein in Cambridge, developed specifically for these lecture demonstrations, a technique to manipulate them using heating and cooling to create these colors and moving effects between 2 slices of glass. So there are other effects that he created by manipulating that space between the bulb and the lens in very early projectors. So it's very sort of Heath Robinson. Instead of using slides, putting the slides in that space between the bulb and the lens, he put circuit boards dipped in water and sprayed with graphite or droplets of black ink into vials of water mixed with glycerin to slow down their dispersal. And then he would move the lens forward and backward to vary effects. The image on the top right is an example of that as a projection. He would also insert a glass rod slowly in those little vials to force the glycerin upwards, sort of anti-gravity effect, if you like, and projected those through hundreds of tiny holes, each of which was a water-filled prism. Endless repeatable change was what he was after. There were other moire effects of putting 2 pieces of perforated metal or plastic together and adding water and moving them in relation to one another. And that's what you can see in the center. So, as I said, this was my point of entry, really, to Gustav practice, and it was quite a surprise, actually, because it was not the artist that I thought I knew at all, and much of my time spent working with Gustav was trying to figure out how these works related to the practice that I knew, the practice and the politics that I was aware of prior to working with him. Anyway, these works came about because in 2012, Gustav Metzger and some of his associates, Leanne and Ulla came, no, not Leanne, sorry, it was just Ulla, came to Cambridge actually to ask Kettle's Yard, where I was working at the time, if we could help him to get the Fitzwilliam Museum to do a show of his drawings, the drawings that were in Documenta. And sadly, we couldn't exert any influence over the Fitzwilliam, but we did humbly ask if he would be interested in working with us. And that's where it started. But of course, Gustav said, well, not the drawings, that's not appropriate. What was appropriate, though, he felt, was exploring this connection to Cambridge, which I've already mentioned. And that was primarily the lecture demonstrations which he presented in Cambridge in 1960 and then in 1965, and his work with Arnold Feinstein, who helped develop the technique to manipulate the liquid crystals. So these were that was the basis for our collaboration, and the exhibition, the research that we did towards this exhibition was primarily, as Gustav put it, creatively revisiting these techniques and processes. And the phrase that Andrew mentioned in his talk, this sense of a loop back in time, strikes me as something of a methodology that was instigated by Metzger for engaging or reading into his practice, particularly, and the project that we did, the first project we did together, was exactly that. So in terms of aesthetics, which is what I'm supposed to be talking about now, the poet Dom Silvestre Huerta provided one of the only descriptions of these light projections that survives, and it's pretty psychedelic, as you might imagine, from the 1960s. But he describes some of the phrases that he uses to describe the projections are like this: a moment of op beauty, elusive menace and psychosensation, an erotic situation in the dark with light and shadows giving a direct physical impact, a Barbarella space world. So it was very much in keeping with the kind of cultural mood of the time, and this sense of a kind of expanding consciousness, but which for Metzger had, I think, an implicit social dimension. And he talks in some detail about new depths of sensation and experience in the 1965 lecture at the Architecture Association. And he talks about quantum theories of matter, energy and forces, and the effects of material transforming art on the autonomic nervous system. Later, of course, in the 1990s, he also talked about exhibitions themselves in terms of psychic space and complex aesthetic experiences. But I think at this point, Metzger had in his sights a new aesthetic paradigm that would draw on the most recent scientific and technological developments and discoveries. This would catalyze new ways of thinking and forms of knowledge and different behavior. In short, I think it would lead to tiny incremental changes to a new social order. And I suppose this might be clearer if I show you these works. In the top left, you can see a documentary photograph from Extremes Touch, the exhibition that Andrew mentioned in Swansea in 1968. And the fact that that took place in a filtration lab in the Department of Chemical Engineering at the University College in Swansea was really important to Gustav. More on that later, but first of all, the image that you can see there is actually some nylon pipes attached to an air outlet. It's a variation of a work referred to as, I think, Water 2 in some notes that Gustav wrote down at the behest of John Latham, actually, after the event in the summer of 1969, and they are reproduced in a catalogue by Matthew Copeland from Lyon, I think. But the emphasis at Swansea was on natural processes and chemical or physical reactions and random activity in these material transforming processes. So not only acid on nylon or rust, which was one of the key factors in some of his proposals for autodestructive monuments, but also things like drop on a hot plate, which actually had a number of different manifestations. And the version that we recreated in Cambridge actually involved water, a constant flow of water being taken to a hot plate via a copper pipe, and the water flow is adjusted just so that the droplet appeared completely still. In effect, what was happening underneath was the water was evaporating and hydrogen and oxygen molecules were kind of colliding and evaporating, and it was actually this flurry of kinetic energy release. But on the surface, what you saw, you could hear slight hissing, but you just saw this still droplet. Other manifestations have had completely different effects, and I think that's part of the process that Gustav really enjoyed, trying different things, different aesthetic experiences for different contexts. So there was drop on a hot plate, where you could vary the effects from the Leidenfrost effect to the one I described in Cambridge. We explored rainbows using light and water sprays in darkened rooms, all of which were initially explored in Swansea. And I might just explain, this was an installation that happened over 2 weeks, and it was in the depths of the university, so visitors were guided to the laboratory by the person who had organized the arts festival that was the umbrella event that this exhibition took part in. So visitors were taken to the laboratory, and Gustav would be in there, and he would choreograph these effects, these different aesthetic experiences. So the drop on the hot plate, or the air pipes, or rainbows, or liquid crystals, of course, and for visitors in the space. And this would happen once in the 2 hours around lunchtime and at 2 hours around tea time. I suppose the other thing I wanted to mention, go back. The thing about liquid crystals is that they're such a perfect example of the kinds of materials that Gustav was interested in, because they represented this particular state of matter between conventional liquid and solid crystals, and they had the capability of shifting between the two. They're also abundant in the natural world. Examples would include like clay or soap, and also something called the tobacco mosaic virus. So they were so important and intrinsic that was the piece that he continued to work on and developed as a permanent installation. But in Swansea, that was created in a sort of cubicle room with one of the overhead projectors type machines. And also different every time. The experiences or the effects that Metzger would conjure were different according to the sorry, my internet connection is unstable, so I'm sorry if anybody is missing any of this. I don't know what to do about that, but fingers crossed, I'll carry on. Anyway, where was I? So they were different every time. And so when we came to producing the works for Cambridge, we weren't necessarily slavishly reproducing what we thought had been documented. For instance, some of the effects with air, he used the compressed air to direct the flow of air, the currents, so that we could make a polystyrene sheet levitate. This is something that we tried, but he wasn't really satisfied with. And the images that you see here are experiments which took place in an abandoned warehouse that was at the time being used as artist studios. And one of the artists, C.J. Mahoney, who was involved in this space, Aidan Abet, was also closely involved in developing these pieces with Gustav and myself. And the people that you can see in that picture in the corner are CJ and the technician from Kettlesyard, Paul, and actually my son, who's a 7-year-old, who had to hang around while we were doing this after school. But in the event, the piece that we made, Dancing Tubes, was something I don't think that actually transpired in Swansea. It was a new piece, and a different version. Obviously, for a gallery, we didn't have the kind of continuous source of compressed air that the laboratory had, so we brought in a compressor to create the air pressure, and this introduced a completely new dimension as well in terms of the noise and the energy and the kind of sense of aggression that this piece suddenly acquired. Anyway, as I said, the fact that this took place in a laboratory was crucial for Gustav, because his sense of working with science was really, really important. I'm sorry, I've lost my notes, but in 1959, he was one of the first people to promote collaboration between artists and scientists, and he felt that an artistic exploration of scientific method and processes would result in new kinds of knowledge being produced and disseminated, rather than the rational and mechanistic views of the natural world that was being presented by the scientific establishment, which crucially he saw as being totally embedded in capitalist social structures. So, in fact, in 1965, a couple of days after his lecture his lecture in Cambridge, he wrote an article in Granta where he actually called on people to use science to destroy science. Absolutely unequivocal. But I think the revolutionary potential of aesthetic experience for Gustav harks back to quite an unusual sort of intellectual artistic strain, and that is, bear with me, German Romanticism. Now, Metzger was always conscious of, and in his lectures he took pains to situate himself within an intellectual and artistic trajectory of ideas, and I'm thinking particularly of early Romanticism, and two key tenets of the movement in particular. One is their theory of aesthetics, which is rooted in concepts of nature, the Naturphilosophy of Schelling and Novalis et al., which positions the artist's activity as continuous with and integral to nature. But also their politics, and this is a often overlooked aspect of Romanticism, but the Romantics saw aesthetics as a tool to employ in the pursuit of Bildung, an Enlightenment term, but something that they very much espoused, which means education in culture, social reform, and it wasn't simply a reaction against or rupture from the Enlightenment, but a genuine attempt to find a third way between the classical world and modern society. The other aspect of these pieces is that transcendence or transformation is crucial. It's symbolic, but it also ties into another intellectual tradition of dialectical thinking, dialectical materialism. And as Gustav often acknowledged, his Jewish heritage, thinking dialectically is inherent to Judaism, he would say. And he saw autodestructive art as thousands of dialectical pinpricks whose cumulative impact could be revolutionary. And at the time, if you think of it, in the 1960s, dialectics was kind of in the air. The Dialectics of Liberation Congress happened in 1967, the year after Metzger and Sharkey had organized the Destruction in Art Symposium. But there was also the student protest movement, and Herbert Marcuse, the guru of the New Left, who's a key proponent of dialectical method, whose theory of the Aufhebung of art, which means sort of, it's kind of has these dual conflicting interpretations in English: to preserve or abolish, to sublate art, meaning the end of the segregation of the aesthetic from the real, believing that the aesthetic had a key role to play in the reconstruction of society as a work of art. So the other aspect that I wanted to draw your attention to with these slides, and in the work that I did with Metzger, is sort of demonstrated with this last slide. And that's the importance of randomness and the random in art for Gustav. And here, when I'm thinking about the notion of transcending the author's hand. In his last manifesto in 1964, it was called On Random Activity in Material Transforming Art. He said, at a certain point, the work takes over. It is in activity beyond the detailed control of the artist, reaches a power, grace, momentum, transcendence, which the artist could not achieve except through random activity. So let me just, what I'm showing you here are two plotted drawings that were made in 1970, where Metzger worked with some of the most recent technology. Plotters were early forms of inkjet printers, and he also worked with another person, giving them a set of instructions to make the plotter produce drawings according to these instructions. When we came to doing these light drawings, which you see at the bottom in 2014, initially, I suppose they were inspired by the dancing tubes, because we used air to make one series of them, but also it was important that we were using another technology, natural forces, air and light, and other people as creative agents. So the production process for the light drawings involved Gustav and I spending a couple of days in a photographic studio in Cambridge, a dark room where we could make these drawings immediately on photosensitive paper. And the ones on the left, the two portrait format ones, were made with Gustav issuing a set of instructions about how to hold this long cable with a tiny fiber optic light on the end of it, giving me directions as to how to move in the space to make the drawing over the paper, of course not switching it, and then I would execute it. And the ones on the right hand side were made using allowing the fiber optic cable to hang as the dancing tubes did in space, but they were directed with currents of air from different directions over a short period of time, allowing the light to trace the movement of these tubes in the dark. So I suppose the point I wanted to make with these is that they circle back, I think, to the rubbish bags and the cardboards. Although his description of machine art in Arc in 1962 actually has some interesting points on the conscious or unconscious involvement of the worker in the production process. But as I said, they also are very much embody this notion of looping back in time. The process that we went through, and the fact that these are actually early works, but also late works. Indeed, they're the last things he actually made. So I suppose I want to end with a bit of a question, and that is the question about what is the point of transcending the artist's hand, particularly in relation to the issues that he was concerned with nature and humanity's self-destructive tendencies, and our inextricable interdependency with the natural world. And I'm wondering, I don't really know, but was it the point that he makes in his last manifesto, which he begins it with actually, was it belief? Because that manifesto begins, certain major forms of art can be described as the drawing of belief. That's a starting point for what is quite a mystical manifesto. But I thought it's something that I've never managed to kind of finally pin down. And maybe this is a great opportunity to hand it over to you guys and maybe discuss. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to Leanne and anticipate some really interesting questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Lizzie. Thank you so much for that wonderful talk, Andrew as well. I just wanted to say we're having a bit of a problem with our chat in the fact that you're not actually able to raise your hand, as David mentioned earlier, unfortunately. So you will have to type any questions into the chat. I've just typed in a little myself so you can see what I'm talking about. But I do have two questions to start off with. So I'll relay the questions as they come into Andrew and Lizzie. So the first is from David. He says, it appears many of Metzger's early works are both unsigned and dated. This is clearly a stylistic or ethical or moral standpoint that works against the idea of the biographical aspect of expressionism. How significant is this gesture? Or perhaps more significantly, what did Metzger himself say about this choice? It's an interesting one, isn't it?
Well, I've just been talking about Metzger's relationship, his engagement with the idea of authorship and his deliberate withdrawal from his presence, an authorial presence in the artworks, in the works that I was just talking about. So from that, I would say that I think he is certainly interested in this notion of stepping away from the work, but I wouldn't like to translate that onto works that he did 15 years previously. I don't know.
I think it's a really very interesting question for precisely those reasons, but also the fact that I can think of only one painting by Gustav that is signed, and that was signed after the event. So I'm not quite sure when it was signed. I'm thinking about paintings pre-1958. I can't think of any drawings that are signed. Maybe there's some that are initialed. There are very few that are dated. That in terms of drawings, and it's almost as if there is a sort of willful privacy about that sort of activity. But at the same time, I think there was always the sense in his mind, potentially, I mean, thinking about the way he spoke about his work in the mid-60s, his early work, that though these were complete expressions, there were stages that he was going through, a sense of going back, thinking about traditions of art, but also moving forwards again, which, I mean, Lizzie, you discussed really absolutely in your presentation now. I think this sort of swing of the need for aesthetics, but also the need to communicate something meaningfully, a sense of, on the one hand, pursuing revolutionary practice as an activist and pursuing a revolutionary activity as an artist. On one, he at one point he thought, I'm going to stop being revolutionary, I'm going to be an artist. And then not, sort of by the end of the 50s, he'd reached a point where the two things were absolutely coalesced. And that point of coalescing was also a point at which the artist as an ego takes the back seat, a sense of achieving transcendence. I mean, it's sort of remarkable fifth manifesto where he discusses that sense of the absolute need for aesthetics and the absolute need to provide a structure to communicate what needs to be communicated. In that world, the signed artwork, it's irrelevant, really. And I think that sense of understanding that point, that position by 1964, 65, I think marks that point which he wasn't yet at by 1960, of understanding how to place the work that he had made through the 40s and the early 50s. In 1960 at the Temple Gallery, these were the stages he went through, and painting and auto-destructive art through the acid on nylon technique was, a continuum of sorts. But by 1965, he realized that there was a real rupture, and it was a really significant one. It's like a total category shift and step change in terms of what art is, really. So I kind of, I mean, I don't know if that really answers the question, but it's, yeah. And I was really struck, Lizzie, with your presentation and sort of thinking about Marcuse and idea of sublation and this sort of, dialectics of preservation and abolition, sort of as a sort of matrix. It is a loop, but it's also a sort of matrix through which the earlier work, and thinking about the Documenta presentation in particular, sort of as a way of explaining, and I kind of, on the one hand, whenever I'm thinking about those works and faced by them, and I think, gosh, the majority of them are undated. It's a real puzzle. And then on the other hand, thinking, well, actually the broad sweep we understand because Gustav had mapped that out in preparation for the Documenta show. And what really counts is, it's too extreme. It's a work of 2012, and thinking about that as actually as important, if not more important, than the kind of the intricacies of working through a sort of cataloguing of what these works are. I mean, I think both are important, but I kind of feel that, if I'm honest to myself, it's what happened in 2012 and subsequently that was the key thing. The choice to reveal those works at a certain moment. The number of times I asked him up from 1983 on, where are your work? Where is your work from the fourth? What did your work look like? And it was just guesswork. It was like little clues and so forth. But it was all there was that blue steel painting, and he could have revealed them at any time. I mean, they were there in the attic, kind of thing.
And he was very self-conscious about his identity, and that process that we went through, that creative revisiting, it was a deliberate gesture. I mean, maybe it was partly to do with the moment in his life that we were going back to that, and it was also as part of that process, we actually visited a mikvah in Cambridge, and I really felt this sense of revisiting this history and bringing history back into a project, and making it an atemporal sort of gesture. That perhaps that was his intention, to kind of, because history was such an important issue for him. This notion of the dialectic as well, this sort of context, this intellectual context that he was working in. Maybe it's, this gesture was a methodology that he felt was most appropriate to his understanding his practice and the importance of his work today.
Yeah.
I thought an interesting question, just for most of the audience, might be, probably from you, Andrew, what was Metzger's own reaction to seeing those works again after so many years?
Well, I wasn't there when they were taken out of the attic. I was there in the storage when they were sort of delivered.
Yeah.
And I remember a kind of, it was like he was looking, I mean, it's natural. He was looking at things he hadn't looked at for years. He remembered some things, he didn't remember other things. It's like, and quite remarkable things, I thought, he didn't really remember. Sort of the Kodak, the paintings on Kodak boxes, which, when I first saw, again, you project, looking at some of these paintings, you think, oh, that's from that has to be 1958. You know that the steel paintings are supposedly the last steel paintings. So you think, wow, these are really amazing paintings from 1958, maybe 1959. And then he sort of didn't really remember having done them, which was staggering. And then really staggering when you realize that they're actually, after he'd started to evolve the acid on nylon technique. They date from 1960, 61, 62. And they're really, I mean, when you look at them up close, some of them, the paint is, as you were saying, Lizzie, I mean, it's incredibly sensual, incredibly gesture heavy, but also not, I mean, it set up these strange dialogue between that sense of sensuality and absolute violence. And I think there's sort of, again, this aesthetics comes absolutely into play there. Sort of this, you're looking at something that is, in a sense, beautiful and horrible. The cuts of the palette knife into the surface, a little bit like the way the acid eats the nylon. It's kind of beautiful and horrifying in equal measure. And he used this term aesthetics of revulsion. And I think, I mean, when I was first encountering these works as documentation, fuzzy photographs and so forth, I thought, wow, this is, this is real unaesthetic stuff. This is heavy duty, good, great stuff. But actually, it took a long time for me to really properly understand how rooted in aesthetics and aesthetic experience he absolutely was all the way through, even when, as you were saying, Lizzie, working with, technology, which on the face of it seems very black and white, and yet absolutely not. And because he's using it to transcendent, the aim of transcendence, which is, sort of pitching technology and nature together as a way of, attacking science using science.
Well, that's I'm thinking about his use of technology. That piece that's most iconic in terms of his use of technology is the Unrealized project, 5 screens with computers. That public art piece, which was supposed to involve 5 screens, which were as large as multi-story buildings in a densely populated environment. So in somewhere like a housing estate within tower blocks, And the idea was that the computers would be programmed, so somebody would write a program to release the screens, these glass screens from these tall buildings randomly over a period of 20 years. And you just imagining the physical shock of that experience, the absolute sort of trauma, but also a sort of sense of beauty. I mean, it's sublime, isn't it? It's almost like the sublime. That really connects to that, to what you were just saying there, I think, Andrew. And I was also reminded of what he must have taken from those Nuremberg rallies when he talked about the spectacle and the pageantry and all of those, you know, the power of aesthetics there. It wasn't just an intellectual response. They were also terrifying as well. So perhaps that's that route, because I know that, you know, this aesthetics of revulsion is really key, but I also wonder whether, you know, can we broaden this notion of aesthetics and aesthetic experience to include beauty, but beauty always having this terrifying side or difficult side?
Yeah. I mean, he talks about beauty a lot, if you asked him, and it was always beauty with that other face as well. You know, it was, you know, it's a little bit like, you know, in 1948, I guess it was 1948, he traveled and saw the Grunwald's Isenheim altarpiece, you know, and that sort of work is exactly that. It's beautiful and horrific, and the horror is in the beauty, and it's about belief and transcendental thinking, you know, it's transcendence. So, you know, he was, you know, as I've kind of journeyed through his work, what seems somehow almost incoherent, you know, the jumping from use of different materials and methods and all the rest of it, it actually coalesces and comes together into something that's utterly consistent. You know, the vision he had was you know, was really well formed.
Thanks both. We have a change of direction in terms of the discussion. I have a question from Cecily, who's asking, is it known what Bomberg thought of Metzger's work after their work together ended?
I think that's an impossible question to answer, because there was such a split between them that, you know, it's hard to know. I mean, what is sure is that Gustav was very, you know, was one of the most favored of the artists that attended Bomberg's classes. And I say artist because he attended the classes over such a long period that at the beginning, yes, he was a student. But by the end, you know, by the early 50s, certainly, he certainly wasn't, and had exhibited and all the rest of it. So, and he was one of the most favored, and was very close to Bomberg until 1953, when, for, you know, what must be many different reasons, quite substantial reasons, they split. But it would be impossible, I think, to second guess what Bomberg thought of Gustav's work after that. And yeah.
Yeah, I think what is clear is the other side, which is that Metzger often mentioned the great influence of Bomberg, and often said that he was one of the most influential figures in his entire life. So yeah, although we can't really guess what Bomberg thought, we know what Metzger thought.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, then that's clear. I mean, the exhibition at the Temple Gallery in 1960 was essentially a form of homage to Bomberg, as much as anything else, and to the practice and approach to art making that he encouraged. And, you know, that's quite clear both in that little text that I quoted, but also in terms of the fact that the exhibition included one drawing that was explicitly by Metzger and by Bomberg as well. You know, and so giving that sense of connection to, you know, the master, as it were.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think we've run out of questions at the moment. So, and also we're nearing 7:30. So really at the end of the event anyway. But I just want to say thank you so much to both of you, Andrew and Lizzie. Those were wonderful talks, and they are being recorded. So hopefully at some point soon they'll be up on the website as well at Ben Uri, so that people will be able to rewatch them, or those who didn't get a chance will be able to see them for the first time. But I just also wanted to mention a quick note. Obviously, as David mentioned at the beginning, this is just one in the event series around Metzger's work. There's another event on the 21st next week. So do sign up for that. It's a film screening, a film about Gustav and a work that he was doing, and a Q&A afterwards as well. So, but beyond that, obviously there are other events too. So do take a look at the website and sign up. But yes, thank you so much to both of you, and obviously to everyone who attended. I don't know if David, you wanted to come back in and say anything more?
And to wish everybody well, and look forward to seeing you on many Wednesday evenings. We're halfway through a 10 event series, and please check out, if you can't come to the exhibition, check out benuri.org. There's 4 or 5 exhibitions on Metzger now available, as well as 40 other exhibitions and many other marvels to explore. I wish you all well, and Sarah McDougall, our director, will be back next week, so all systems go. Stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.